So, as mentioned, I dress like I live in a museum. It's my banker's outfit. But I do live in a museum. It's the historic dockyard in Chatham, Kent, which is one of the oldest places building warships in the world. And the technology that made the difference for building the British Empire came out of that dockyard, which is rope. So if you want to hear this whole story about rope technology, grab me later. But now we're going to talk about payments technologies and investing in payments companies. And Bob from Naspers and Laurent from PayU, very welcome to the stage. I guess to begin with, because not everyone will know Naspers very well, it's a $112 billion investment company based out of South Africa. Maybe you can give us a little bit background on the company itself and what drives your investments.
No, absolutely, Chris, and thanks a lot for hosting us here today. So, as a group, we basically are investors and operators of consumer technology, and we do that in more than 120 countries around the world. What we really love are fundamental consumer needs that technology can change. And we are a big operator, so we have about 26,000 employees all around the world. We're also a big investor. Probably most well-known for our investment in Tencent. We own about a third of Tencent in China, but also in online food delivery, where we're one of the largest players in the world, in classifieds, and actually most excitingly in payments through PayU.
And one of the big investments that paid off was in Tencent, which is the big Chinese internet giant. I believe the investment was $32 million in 2001, worth about $160 billion today. How do you see Tencent and WeChat Pay and what's happening in China?
Yeah, if you would have asked me 3 years ago whether WeChat Pay would be in a position they are now, I would have probably said that is basically impossible. But they've done a remarkable job at sort of leveraging and integrating their payment products in all the social and the other activities they do. They've done it in such a customer-focused and effective way. They've really, in terms of transactions, actually have overtaken Alipay. I think that's a phenomenal achievement. I think as a whole, the company, if you look at the space that Tencent takes in the online mobile lives of Chinese customers, they have about 50% of all minutes that Chinese customers spend on mobile internet, 50% is in a Tencent property. So I think that sets them up to potentially be the largest company in the world.
I guess just before I come to Lauren, you've got a stable of companies, not just Tencent, that you've invested in, many of which you've also exited, like Allegro in Poland and Flipkart in India, which are very successful investments. How do you build your investment model? I mean, is it like SoftBank that you're trying to build an ecosystem of complementary companies, or do you see Naspers as different?
Yeah, we're quite different from the Vision Fund, and I mean, I'm a big admirer of Masa and what he's built. If you look at our focus, it comes from a different angle, right? So we have a very thesis-driven investment approach where we form a view on which technologies and models we think are going to really work. Can be quite narrow. And then we look for excellent people who can run with it. So it's very entrepreneur-driven, and we typically we've deployed about $10 billion of capital, really in three main segments. So in fintech, in commerce, and now in food delivery. So we are, I would say, much more focused, equally aggressive, but we try to build up real expertise in the areas where we invest.
And you do have quite a lot of fintech companies in the portfolio. Why PayU?
So PayU is actually, and to Laurent and the team's great credit, actually started as a number of separate companies that were brought together, the technology integrated, and I think where they've done a phenomenal job is actually take that basic starting point of different entities and build it into a global play.
Now, looking at PayU, Laurent, my impression is that you've got an API capability that can be easily deployed in specific markets. You've got a number of countries that are very fast-growing markets. Can you just quickly give us an overview?
Yeah, so actually a conversation started 2 years ago, with Bob, say, look, we've got this payments business in high-growth markets, but we really want to make it really one of the biggest financial services player. How do you do that? So I think the transformation for us is three things. The first one is you move from payments to financial services, because fundamentally, when you have a payments business, you have only two assets. It's the payments data you generate, and the second thing is the merchant distribution network. That's the first angle, right? So I think one of the real competitive advantage that we have is truly to be very deep locally in the fastest growing markets around the world, like India, for instance, right? The second thing is really moving from serving merchants to serving consumers. The moment you start, delivering consumer credit at the point of sale, you have a consumer business. And the third one, and that's really the philosophy, of Naspers, is how you move from being a pure operator of your business to becoming a strategic investor. And I think it's all in the word strategic, meaning that, look, we see the ecosystem around fintech in all of our markets, right? From Latin America to Africa to India. The reality is how you scale all these fintech players. It's not just about capital that you deploy. It's around the data that you can use really to feed, these businesses. And then the second thing is how do you actually, create a real ecosystems with really reinforcing synergies. So these are the three things that we do, but the focus and really the differentiation is we only do growth markets. And we have 18 markets, but actually we are present in 5 of the top 10 fastest growing, digital payments around the world.
And we've been talking before we came on stage about the markets that you're in, and they're quite diverse. So you've got Russia, Poland, Nigeria, yes. South Africa, India, Argentina. I mean, how do you pick these countries?
Part of it, is these were businesses already serving all the other companies that were part of the Naspers group. I mean, you've seen the eBay PayPal story, right? It's quite an advantage when you start a payments business out of, a very successful, e-commerce franchise, right? So that's one. The second thing is actually, it's not so much now a question about which country. I think at the minimum, you need to be a regional players now. That's the game in payments, right? It's all about consolidation, right? So for us, a big part of the work has been to consolidate all these payments businesses around regional platforms. And then, when it comes for us, based on our investment thesis and really the long-term view we take is, where do we want to place our bets? As I always say, I prefer, to be number 1 in Poland than to be, number 1 in Western Europe, if you look at growth. I really prefer, to spend half of my time in India, because this is where most of the disruption is coming, but this is where actually you have the biggest opportunity so far. And, I've been 15 years in payments. What has been achieved in India in 18 months is really unheard of. Actually, even China did not achieve, what has been built in India, which is a true open platform for payments. That's quite massive. Just one stat, if you look over the past 3 years, okay, if you look at all the new bank accounts opened around the world, 1 in 2 was opened in India. And that's because, you have the biggest disruptor of all, which is the Indian government, actually. So that's for us, the massive opportunity that we have. And again, in India, we have 60% of all e-commerce transactions going through the platform, so massive amount of data. This gives you the right to play in other segments.
I think one of the key things around what we're seeing in payments right now is markets that have scale, like India, creating whole new ideas about how to do things with money from the ground up, and demonetization is driving that UPI, Aadhaar. Maybe we can talk about India for a little while. Have you invested in any other companies in India, Bob?
You could almost ask which companies didn't we invest in India. So no, we've invested in payments in a big way, and Laurent can speak more to it, but we, in payment service provider business, we're by far the largest in the market. We are the largest shareholder in the online travel space, in online food delivery, and we also, until recently, were a very big investor in Flipkart.
And in particular, what do you see is happening in the Indian markets that's different?
There's a few things. First of all, it's the sheer scale of the market, right? So you have 1.3 billion customers there, but that number doesn't even really illustrate the magnitude of change. So if you go back a decade, I think there were about 10 million internet users in India, right? Really not interesting. And then if you go back 5 years, it was maybe at 30, still as big as France, right? But now it has 400 million internet users, which is bigger than the US. And 3 years from now, it probably have 800 million internet users. That's almost as big as China. So that speed of internet adoption in India is faster than anything that's ever happened in the world. And that, in its way, creates innovation that we also have never seen in the world. So some of the things that Laurent mentions around UPI are transitions that are not only experiments, but experiments at massive scale. I think therefore there will be enormous wealth creation in tech in India at a pace we've never seen before.
And bearing in mind that we're talking about a session that has the title of Business Reincarnation, which I guess is all about digital transformation. We see massive digital transformation taking place in China and India, in the African nations, in South America, and yet in Europe and America, I guess because we have so much infrastructure from the last century that we have to upgrade and renovate. An awful lot of what we see as fintech in Europe and America, I think, is actually trying to take the friction out of that legacy infrastructure rather than reinventing or reincarnating the infrastructure. Would you guys agree?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, it's, again, just give you another data point, if you look at UPI, which is truly an open, payment platform, everybody can plug into it. So your WhatsApp, you go to India, you can start doing P2P just using this open platform. In 18 months, since the launch of UPI, there's been more transactions on UPI than the total number of transactions for all the card networks in 30 years. So that gives you an idea of the scale, but also the acceleration. We don't have this type of legacy, right? What it means also is sometimes you need to, of course, build the whole infrastructure, from scratch. You need to build also the whole suite of services. But the destination for sure is also around digital banking. So, you talk a lot about, in your books, about the legacy of all the big banks. You have very successful banks in these markets, right? I think they think the same, on the same lines, really always, serving the top 10% of the market when actually the big opportunity is in the middle of the bell curve. And for that, you need to come up with a completely new playbook, for sure. The technology there, the demand is there, certainly, and I think what is more important is you see the government and the regulator actually pushing dramatically for innovation. And I think sometimes in Europe we still have some questions on this. Actually, you should see how progressive are these countries in pushing digitalization, sometimes at the cost of the consumer. Yeah. People will say we force.
Yeah, and I agree with you. And if you look back 15 years ago when we started investing in India and China, I mean, people thought we were absolutely crazy, right? So at the time, there was no ecosystem. There were a very limited number of internet users. Now, if you ask people who are in the tech investment business, I don't think anybody looks primarily at the Bay Area for innovation anymore. They look at China, they look at India. So that sort of center of gravity has moved very, very quickly.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because we've talked for a long time about a war on cash and becoming a cashless society, but the cashless societies are going to be India and China first by the look of it.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, you and I shared a common experience in China where, trying to buy something is quite challenging for a Westerner. Do you want to share the story?
Yeah, no, for sure. So I'm in China a few times a year. We're in Beijing. We're actually having a drink with a few colleagues, all non-Chinese. And except for one, we had one Chinese colleague with us, and we having a lot of drinks. And then when the moment came to pay, somebody pulled out his credit card, wasn't accepted. Somebody pulled out cash, wasn't accepted. So if we weren't there with our Chinese colleague, we wouldn't have been able to pay. They only accepted WePay and Alipay.
And I think it's quite amusing because I've done a lot of work with Ant Financial and Alipay recently, and they kind of smile at us. And in particular at our mobile wallets, which normally end in pay with some brand that's a leading technology provider before it. And the reason is because if you look at Apple Pay or Android Pay or Samsung Pay, typically you see the plastic card in the app, and they don't understand why you do that because they never had plastic. And I think that just shows this leapfrogging almost of the emerging Southern Hemisphere markets as they implement technology infrastructure over the European and American markets.
Yeah, absolutely. The statistic that blows my mind is that there are 25 million credit cards in India, and there are about 400 million mobile wallets, something like that. So they'll never see a card, as you say.
Exactly.
And what does that do for trade and commerce? I mean, you're dealing with consumers mainly, but the merchants in India must also be embracing these technologies very quickly.
Yeah, I think you see it very clearly. The big push for digitalization, right, of the market and demonetization. You could literally see, from one day to the other, people putting up, on the windows, on the little shops, the QR code of PayTM, which has done a fantastic job, of educating the market. So here again, consumers will leapfrog, the plastic cards. At the same time, the merchants, they will leapfrog the old POS. There's no need for that. It's really phone to phone. That's why it's a fantastic opportunity for people like WhatsApp. I think you can ask yourself also, okay, what's going to happen, to the classic, banking solution, right? The digital banking. Do you need to go, to your branch to do that? Absolutely not. So you already start seeing players. I would say that these markets, by the time you figure out, what's your strategy for wallet, actually they have already moved away from the wallet. It's already one step ahead there. And it's truly, building the whole banking solution from scratch and build the whole banking stack from scratch. That one is quite fascinating. I hope we will see actually, if you take e-commerce, it was usually the big US company coming to Europe and then let's go to emerging markets. I think when it comes to fintech, it's just not going to happen like this at all. The players we see, we don't see anyone really from Europe or from the US really being local. Are we going to see, the reverse trend? It's already happening. You see already, Alipay being a tender mark, accepted, the shops. You see WePay being accepted, in the metro in Paris, which is for me like culturally like, wow, guys, they've evolved. You're going to see the reverse for sure. And especially around all these growth markets, all these companies, they're not looking at, I want to make it big in Europe. They couldn't care less. If you're big in India already, you start looking at Southeast Asia, you start looking at the Middle East, at Africa. So it's really all this Southern Hemisphere play, that's where, most of the growth will be over the next 10 years.
So when we're in markets like Europe and America, the Bay Area, or even the fintech hubs around these markets like London and Berlin, how do we reincarnate our businesses? I mean, how do we deal with this challenge of keeping up with this fantastic innovation coming from Southern Hemisphere?
I think one of the advantages that people like Laurent have is that he spends a lot of time in India, spends a lot of time in China. I think that allows us, for example, to, when we look at fintech startups in Europe, to see what is sort of marginal improvement, and so hard work to marginally improve payment systems in Europe. But you can also say, look, this is something I've seen in China, and this I've seen become a 500 million customer business in 3 years' time in China. So I think it gives you the opportunity to separate real innovation from marginal innovation better. And I think for startups, I think there is just I think customer focus, and I think Steve actually said something similar in his bit. But I think customer focus and really starting with what makes people's lives hard rather than what they have today, I think can really change the way people think about innovation.
Well, looking at legacy, we've had a couple of card companies talking this morning, one of which had a problem in Europe on Friday with payments, and the other had a problem in America on the 10th of May with Dunkin' Donuts. So we're dealing with companies that are decades old. And with Visa's problems on Friday, I was asked on a radio show, does this not mean that customers and citizens should go back to using cash? So what's your response to the fact that when you've got everything relying on technology that has to work, when it doesn't work, what should people do?
Good question, actually. Look, in the markets where we are, I mean, what we see really from the facts is cash is still there, right? I mean, cash on delivery is still one of, the problem for e-commerce sometimes in terms of growth. The whole opportunity is actually how you accelerate your digitalization of this, right? I think where we differ from, Western Europe or the US is we don't believe it's going to be, the existing card rails or the form factor, of a credit card or a piece of plastic that will take you there. Everything is bet really on basically, high-speed internet data, mobile networks. That's it. So at least, we all agree on that, the push for digital money, it's the secular trend. We just cannot afford, to replicate all the card networks. That stuff is already being leapfrogged for sure.
Yeah, and if I look at, say, taking on India and China, I think the world is better off without cash. I think people are better off with a day without donuts than, if you look take a market like Nigeria or India, where cash is actually a source of, it facilitates major corruption, which is probably the biggest problem, systemic problem that these countries have. And I think if you limit the role of cash, you limit that in a great way. I think the society will be better off for it.
Yeah.
Laurent, Bob, great conversation, but we've run out of time, so we're going to have to call it quits there. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Takeaways that you think that we should leave with, like in terms of if you're an innovator, if you're an entrepreneur out there, like is there one thing that you should leave with that we haven't talked about yet?
I can have a go. So I think if you look at the history of our company, when we've done well is when we saw change early on, we went all in.
Yeah.
We went all in with new people, with new companies, new entrepreneurs. When you see things change, don't wait and see.
Don't wait.
Don't wait and see.
Don't wait and see.
Go fast, go hard.
And you would agree from what you've...
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And what we say really for us, for payments is people usually went west. For us, we just go east, just go where the action is. That's the best probably trip you can make. To invest and see what the future looks like. That's it.
And I guess my takeaway would be everyone normally talks about GAFA as the people they're concerned about: Google, Amazon, Facebook, and Apple. My acronym is FATBAG, which is Facebook, Amazon, Tencent, Baidu, which is the Chinese search engine, Alibaba, and Google.
That's brilliant. All right, good. We'll be focusing on the fat bags then. So thank you very much, gentlemen. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.